Your policies are failing you, and you don't know it until crisis hits. Most organizations write their policies to manage the 5% who might cause problems. But what's that costing you with the other 95%? More than you think, especially when disruption strikes and those policies get tested under pressure. I'm Kim Bohr, host of Courage to Advance, and today's guest is Mitchell Jeffery, founder of Ember Collective and an HR leader who's made a career of flipping conventional wisdom on its head by designing policies that are built on trust instead of control. We have a lot to get to, so let's dive in. Mitchell, welcome to the Courage to Advance podcast.
Thanks. I'm excited to be here.
So you named your company Ember Collective, which immediately signals that you're doing something very different. What does that name mean? And how did you come to bringing that into being? And where does it connect with your philosophy about HR?
Ember Collective, if we kind of break it down into the two different words. So Ember, as we kind of all know, right, are the kind of leftovers from, a fire, if you will. And for me, when we think about that as an organization, what that is everything the organization's already done really well for themselves, or the things that they've built. And sometimes it's just kind of sitting there waiting to be reignited, if you will. That's kind of the purpose on the part of the Ember, is everything the organization's already done. And then when we think about the word collective often is really kind of this idea of this joint movement, or in my case, kind of a theoretical thought or idea about how to do something differently. And so it's kind of how does my organization approach HR differently while combining it with what the organization has already built for themselves.
And so talk a little bit more about what are some of the areas that your organization focuses in most on around HR. And I know we'll get a little bit more into it as we go through our conversation today, but just kind of some of those highlights to give people a little more context.
Yeah. So, we kind of specialize in behavioral health and healthcare as kind of our bread and butter, although we work with small businesses across any industry. But the way we approach things a little bit differently is we're trying to help organizations get back to thinking about how do the decisions we make actually impact our people, and how can we kind of leverage utilizing that human capital to actually increase revenue, productivity, all of those things. So, there's kind of a different approach into how do we look at policy? What does policy look like for organizations? Maybe what do benefits look like? And certainly, how do we approach employee relations? So how do I actually navigate difficult conversations with my employees? Or what do I maybe need to be reminded about, that they are in fact a human, and maybe today was just a bad day for them, right? And so it's really kind of more bringing a more human-centered approach and really reminding leaders about that as we work through issues.
So important for that reminder for many, many leaders. So, something that you and I have talked about in the past has been, some research that we did. And I wanted to bring this forward into our conversation because I think it's very relevant to how the philosophy you're bringing in for organizations. So our research shows that 71% of employees have experienced major disruptions in the last 24 months. What we also found, though, is that organizations that handled it well reported a 12% higher trust dividend, as we called it, over those employees that had faced no disruption at all. And so you've talked about in the past where most policies are written really more to manage problem children rather than really support that larger 90%. So what's the connection between that kind of control-based policy world and really trust during disruption?
So yeah, I do believe that most policies are written to manage the 10% of employees that, really are the problem children or doing the wrong thing, right? Because they're often the ones that they're poking the bear. And so we try to fill all the holes so that they can't poke through, right? But what I believe is often when we do that, that inadvertently hurts the 90% of employees who come to work and are just trying to do the right thing, because now we've tied our hands, right? The policy is so black and white that we're kind of stuck, and we can't even support the good employees or maybe our top performers. I think a really simple example about how this affects during disruption, we can look at post-COVID policies, right? It's a really simple example. So, when everybody was working from home, And now all of a sudden we're forcing everybody to return back to the office. And in a lot of cases, that really did break down in trust. And every listener on here knows, I mean, we all saw it on LinkedIn and everything else, right? They don't believe I can do my job, or they don't trust us to do my job, right? When we've been doing this for 3 years, or whatever the case is. And so it was a massive disruption to the quality of life that these individuals had, and severely broke down the trust. So I think that's, probably one of the biggest examples in recent history of how policy really can impact that trust.
When you think about just some of that, what was going on during COVID, and as you said, like the post-COVID return to work, it feels like there's a lot that's not being taken into consideration. You've got people whose lives had to adjust because there wasn't an end date of, hey, we're going to do this remote thing for X amount of time. And it just became the way businesses operated. And I know from just some of the other conversations I've had, right, there's disruption. And even what our research was showing, like disruption of, things like childcare. All of a sudden, I have to make different childcare decisions. Or if I'm caring for an aging parent, so there's this sense of a real disconnect, I think, around fairness as well, when it's like you've not provided me other things or other aspects of what I can do. So I'm curious if some of that is how you see that surfacing in some of the organizations that you work with around how do you help kind of maybe smooth that out better if you can.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, right? And I think a lot of that comes back to, from my perspective, is empathetic leadership, right?
Yeah.
Like, we hear you, we understand this is a challenge, right? And sometimes that means just being honest with folks. I mean, if it really is, that we have this real estate issue, which I think really was probably the crux for most people, right? That, we're honest with them. We have, I think you can be honest without giving everything away, right? And you can be empathetic without giving everything away. Like, we hear you, we understand that this is a challenge. This is the direction that an organization needs to take. And then work with managers to work with their people on an individual level to try to help get them there, that's the direction the organization needs to go. But if that's it, I think empathetic leadership just goes a long way. We hear you and we understand that this is a challenge.
I agree. I think that can't be said enough. One of the things that we also seen, right, our managers are on the front lines enforcing policies every day. And so what happens to that manager-employee relationship when the policy they're enforcing is really built more for those, problem children versus that 90% you talk about?
I mean, I think it really, that trust just, breaks down pretty quickly. The problem is with frontline managers, right? When the policy is so rigid, they end up stuck. They can't work with their people at all. So because the policy is so black and white that even if the employees, they're A star or they're A player, they still have to follow what the policy says. And so then all of a sudden the employee is sitting here going, my manager doesn't care about me. My manager doesn't trust me. My manager doesn't care about what I've got going on in my life. When in fact, that's probably not true at all. Right. But they're being told by somebody higher up, hey, this is what the policy says. This is how you need to manage it. So it really does kind of, fuel the feeling of being unsupported, and then leaves frontline managers feeling powerless, all because we have this policy that's so black and white.
Can you give an example of one of those policies that you've seen in the past that were perhaps created in a way that just isn't serving the larger population?
Yeah, I mean, the one that sticks out to me initially is always attendance policies. I'll be honest, most attendance policies are a point-based system, right? So, you show up X minutes late, you get X number of points. You are unexcused absence, you get X number of points, right? Although, many of the listeners and other HR people are probably going to hate that I say this, right? Because they're like, but point-based systems are so fair and they're, you can't, fudge them, if you will, right? They're the same for everyone. But the problem is that doesn't leave any room for life to happen, which does happen. And from my perspective, it is not fair or equitable in either case to treat an employee that has been an A-star player for 5 years and life just happens. Their mom gets sick. They've got to go take care of them. Their car breaks down, their whatever. And they've had 5 years of good attendance, but now, because life happened, I have to discipline them and or terminate them the same way as though I would an employee who's had attendance issues for maybe just the first 90 days of their employment. So, I've never liked point-based attendance systems. And honestly, I think people would be surprised that if they got rid of them, it's actually just not that hard to manage. It's just people get really, really stuck in needing that very black and white way of managing attendance.
Yeah. Yeah. Feeling like there's something that they can point to, because it's easier to do that than it is just often have to have some of those conversations around, hey, tell me what's going on. Right.
Right.
And it feels like there's some of that kind of nuance. So it leads us into my next question, which you and I have talked, in some conversations leading up to this. You really have a strong belief when you enter into organizations with your firm that policy is often a really great place to start in addressing where opportunities for improvement and strengthening culture is. And so why is it policy versus cultural initiatives or leadership training or some of the many other things that maybe are often starting points?
Yeah. I think policy is a starting point for a variety of reasons. And I'll kind of first, why I don't think leadership training necessarily is because if I'm doing a good job at leadership training, it should also be around what my policies are. And so,
Great point.
And how to manage those policies. And so if the policies are already not helpful, then all we're doing is we're training them on how to manage crisis or how to manage negative reactions to the policies, right? And so, that kind of aside, the other problem is policy drives culture through and through. And so, I can do cultural initiatives all day long, but if they've already feel crappy about the culture because of, terrible policies, it's really not doing much. The other thing is policy is just often cheap and free.
Yeah.
It is very high impact, often with very little, if any, expense tied to it. Now, of course, there are some policies, PTO, bereavement, others that do have expense tied to them, but there's a lot of policies that just don't. Simple ones like dress code. I've never understood why companies have such rigid dress code. All it does is turn off your employees and frustrate them, and it costs you no money to fix it, right? So it's high impact, low cost.
That makes so much sense. So, have you, or I guess I know you've done this. So speak to some, a policy you've redesigned that most HR professionals are really focused on when it's kind of mitigating risks. What are some of those things? Because I know you've alluded to a couple of them.
My favorite one, and I know this is probably going to be a shocker for people to hear me say this, and I actually don't say it lightheartedly, I really mean it, is I really think it is very arrogant for organizations to get to tell me who I care about. And when I say that, I'm directly speaking to bereavement policies, right? Often bereavement policies, they're pretty stereotypical, pretty consistent across the board. We'll say something like, mom, dad, brother, sister, grandma, grandpa, 5 days, 3 days, aunt, uncle, whatever the case is, step siblings, blah, 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 blah. I've never understood those policies, and why does the organization get to tell me who's important to me? That is a simple policy that we can restructure, often again with really no financial impact to the organization. And one company I was with, we completely restructured bereavement to where we did not indicate at all who somebody could take bereavement for. And we just indicated how many days they got per instance, but we didn't even say how many instances they could have a year. Now, of course, we had carve-outs. At the end of the day, it is a fringe benefit. We could still approve it. We could still ask for, proof. Or I'm sorry, we could still deny it, and we can still ask for proof. But, 16 months post-implementation, I had not one issue, none, zero, that I had to ever address. So, I think at the end of the day, that's a simple case study for the fact that if we do just trust our people, policy can work for the 90%, we don't have to be so rigid.
I think that's such a powerful example because it's not just about being something that can be more inclusive and just, and simple. It has such a powerful impact on people feeling commitment to the organization, feeling like they are being seen for what that moment is, and not being judged, and I
Yeah.
think that is really, really powerful and feels like something that more organizations should look at. I think what's also so interesting about all the policy approach you take is that, it's such low hanging fruit where organizations can make real, not just impact, but like, have people feel like they're being looked out
Cared
for.
about.
Yeah, cared about, right? Just that
Yeah.
simple notion. Whereas policies create such a wedge at times. I'm curious what your thoughts are on this. Do you feel like some organizations sometimes lean into too much policy making because it's just easier than having the hard conversations?
Yes. And I also think, it's because it's easier than managing employee relations, you know? And
Yeah.
so I think when you don't have skilled, experienced HR professionals in how to manage employee relations, what you get is HR professionals that create strict policy because they don't actually know what to do when there's a lot of gray.
Yeah.
And so it becomes an easier way to manage issues. And, a lot of people see it as preventing risk because I'm consistent across the board. Yeah, it's strict, but I'm consistent. Right. And so, I think it's a little bit of if we train our HR professionals appropriately in all of the things, we get people that actually know how to manage those situations. And so,
Mhm.
if you've got too strict of policies and your HR people are really insistent on that, I would question whether they might have the employee relations skills that you need to actually manage those situations.
One of the things that's really interesting that comes to mind, just as another question, that is, do you feel like people that don't have this skill, as you say, there's so many HR people go into the profession because of this really sense of high warmth and empathy and caring and taking care of people, and yet that stronger need of enforcing areas, sometimes it feels like it's an either or and it's not a balance. And do you feel like that's some of the underlying challenges that, people are so heavy on the heart that that the policies are a piece that they need to lean on because they don't know how to find a better balance?
True. I think a lot of HR professionals struggle with balance. Prior to, working with the Ember Collective and doing my private consulting, I hired several HR directors that were former VPs, right? And in a lot of instances, older than me with more experience than me. And I would challenge them hard on employee relations. And I had two particularly that I remember, former VPs that ended up, reporting to me, and probably often thought, this young whippersnapper, but often we had really good, difficult conversations around employee relations. And both of them came back to me many, many times and said, I see it now. I get what you're trying to do. Because there is a way to be supportive with employees without having to be so harsh. People are human beings at the end of the day, and we all make mistakes and we all screw up. We do have to find kind of a balance or approach. And it really just might be that the organization has some improvement opportunity.
I like that. So walk us through, you've mentioned this, but I'd like you to take a deeper kind of approach into this question. What is your philosophy around fair versus equitable, and how does that show up in some of that policy design? You've kind of mentioned the words, but I'd love to have people hear you speak more clearly on that.
The difference for me is fair means everybody gets the same thing, right?
Mhm.
Equitable means everybody has the same opportunity for the same things. And so a simple example could be, if you and I are both trying to watch a baseball game and we need to see over a fence to watch this baseball game. Fair means you and I both get a box to stand on to watch the baseball game. But maybe I don't need any boxes and you need 2 boxes, right? Equitable is you get 2 boxes, I get no boxes, we still get to do the same thing, right? And so there are a variety of ways that this can show up in policy. The most stupid, simple example I'll give you, and then I'll give you a second example because this one admittedly is a little silly, but, it's always been like dress code policies for me. Like, often dress code policies are gendered, but
Mm.
if a woman can't wear a mini skirt, I think we're all going to agree that a man showing up with a mini skirt is also not going to work. but somehow we've made it gendered. And so then again, what would you do if a man showed up in a miniskirt? That's not what the policy says. Like, now, you know what I mean? Like, again, I know I'm being flippant. I know I'm being silly, but it's one of those things to me that is
There's
just that
truth to
silly.
it.
Right.
Yes,
Like,
there's truth
why
to
are we
it.
gendering it? Maybe a better and a more structured example would be holiday policies. I understand bulk of America is Christian. And so obviously we tend to follow holiday policies structured around Christian holidays. But why can't we have a carve out in our holiday policy that says, hey, if you don't celebrate Christmas, you can take that day for another holiday that fits your beliefs, belonging, whatever the case is, right? Just an opportunity, again, difference between kind of fair and equitable. We both get to, instead of both of us getting the same thing, we both get the opportunity to celebrate something that's meaningful and important to us.
I think that's a really great example. And again, something that maybe it's a little more complicated than some of the others we've talked about. And yet, if you stop and think about it, maybe it's not, right? And maybe it's more, it's a lot easier to implement than one would think.
It's just not that hard. Yeah. I mean, it feels like it could be really cumbersome, but it's really not. An employee just comes to you and says, hey, again, most of America is Christian, so it's really going to be minor one-offs.
Right. So you have expressed how, HR, it should really spend the majority of its time on employee relations and engagement. And given that what we saw in our research for manager trust drops, 4.5 times during a severe disruption, a crisis, what should HR be doing to prepare managers before a disruption really hits?
I kind of see this as a what car does she drive problem. And Kim, you and I have talked about this before, but for those of you, that don't understand what that means, I gave a talk at Disrupt HR Jacksonville earlier this year, and the title of the speech was Car Does She Drive? And, that the essence of that speech came from a learning moment I had with a mentor of mine. And it really is about the necessity for knowing human beings as human beings. So what car does she drive is really that simple. Like, what car does she drive, right? And, knowing your human beings on a real intimate level. And so I think both HR and managers, when you know your human beings as human beings, it becomes very hard for you or them to dehumanize each other. It becomes really hard for them to, you're the bad person or you're the evil person because they're seeing you as a human being. So when that disruption happens, they're more likely to trust you through that disruption or to follow you because they understand that, you're not out to get them.
Right.
We are working through a troubling time, and I understand that. Again, hear you. Empathy comes back in. But I think that's really the crux of it for me is it's a what car does she drive problem.
I like that. That's a good quick reset analogy, right? Of just trying to, at the most basic level, do we really understand one another and what we're dealing with? And like we talked about earlier, you think about people who are dealing with elder care issues or childcare issues or just a slew of other things. And if we're so out of touch and don't understand that, that's a big miss on a manager's and leader's part. Yeah. So if an organization already, has damaged trust, whether that's maybe through layoffs or just, years of really kind of like we talked about some of these control-based policies, where do they start rebuilding, do you think?
Policy.
Yeah.
Again, just because it does, if you're getting a lot of complaints from employees about a specific policy, there's a reason for that. It is frustrating them. There is lack of trust there. So I really do think, again, high impact, low cost, and it just really is a really, really great spot to start. Now, if you're an operational leader going, but Mitchell, right? Again, I don't know how we're going to manage that. We've got so many issues. I'm going to politely tell you, I think you might have the wrong HR person supporting you. If they cannot help you manage those employee relations issues, their skill set might be the wrong match for what you need, right? Not every HR professional is gifted in that way. And so if you're an operator going, ooh, I don't know, that may be where you need to turn. And it doesn't mean you necessarily have to get rid of that HR person, depending on the size of your organization. That may be an opportunity for somebody like me or another organization to come in and provide that fractional, more executive style support.
And maybe in that, do you find in those types of scenarios, there's maybe skill building or growth opportunity, or you and your firm can come in and kind of assess that whether there's the
Mhm.
fit is there?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I often come in and work with organizations that have HR people, but they're, lower level. They haven't had the experience to go through that. And I work on training them and I warn them all. I'm like, this is going to be really frustrating for you for
Mhm.
3 or 4 months because, my approach is always they call me wanting an answer and I don't give it to them. I say, my first question is always, what do you want to do?
Mhm.
Right. And that frustrates them because they're calling me wanting an answer. But what it does is it teaches them because they'll tell me and I will not answer until they tell me. And then what I do is I say, I like that for these reasons. I don't like it for these reasons. And here's why. So it allows them to start learning my thought process because then it's several months in. And I did this with all my HR directors when I was, an executive. Several months in, then all of a sudden they're calling me and they already know my thought process is, right? We don't have to go through it anymore. And it's a beautiful thing. It's just, it frustrates the heck out of them for a couple
Yeah.
of months.
It's a painful but quick learning
Yeah.
opportunity for everybody. So for leaders that are listening right now and thinking, I want to do this differently, but I just don't know where to start. What's one policy that maybe they would look at, or maybe, the couple of the top that you'd say, hey, start here and see, what would those be?
Yeah, I would say bereavement, attendance, holiday, and PTO. And when I say
Okay.
PTO, I know everybody seems like, oh my God, PTO, right? We can't add more PTO. I'm not saying add more PTO time. I'm saying, how is the PTO policy structured? How do we allow them to take time off? When do we allow them to take time off?
Yeah.
Do we allow PTO donation? Is it all PTO or do we have PTO and sick? Although I actually don't like sick time, I prefer wellness time.
Wellness time. Good point.
Because again, it's their time, or why are we so stringent on they can only use it when they're sick? The whole point is we want them to take care of themselves. Do I care that they went and got a massage? No, I don't. Like they came back to work more rested, right?
Right. They're more
That's,
productive and they're healthier and we don't have to deal with sick. Yeah.
and the employees prefer it too, because then they don't have to feel like they have to call in pretending to be sick, like,
Yeah.
which is what they do anyways. So again, why are we making the policy so rigid? I don't get it.
So, you have expressed through our conversation and the conversations you and I've had that you're really building the Ember Collective as this more thought movement about doing HR differently. So, take a little bit of time as we start to close out this conversation and talk about what does that actually mean? What are you really trying to change that you feel so passionately about?
So, I mean, I think you can kind of see, even in this conversation around policy, right, that what I really, really care deeply about is making sure that employees feel supported and cared about. We all spend more time at work than we do anywhere else. And I can't tell you the number of organizations I've worked for where, like, I didn't feel like I was a member of the team. I didn't feel like they really cared about me. I didn't feel valued, right? And I think these are really simple things that we can do. Again, high impact, low cost. There are other things we can do as well, but kind of why I preach around policy so much. But that's really what I'm trying to do with the Ember Collective is help organizations build a culture and a model where employees feel supported and they feel like they're cared about and they're not just a number. They're not a cog in the wheel just
Mhm.
trugging along for you to make money. Helping leaders really create that culture where their folks feel like you care about me as a human being, right? Because I'll tell you, when I've done that with my teams, they will run into fire for you.
Yep, I agree with you. And I think what you said, it feels so intuitive. And yet you in your firm, us in our firm are dealing with organizations all the time where it's anything but that simple. And so there's plenty of opportunity for improvement all around. So Mitchell, please share with our audience how they can get in touch with you and your team at Ember Collective.
Yeah. So, of course, you can go to the website, which is embercollectivellc.com. If you want to get some more information around the show, it's embercollectivellc.com/spark effect. There is a page out there specific for this episode. And of course, they could call me directly at 865-255-8330.
Fantastic. And I assume they can also connect with you on LinkedIn as
Oh,
well
of
and
course.
you're
Yes.
in the firm as well. Perfect. We'll make sure we put this information in the show notes for the listeners. And Mitchell, I think this has been a really enlightening conversation around just a different way of thinking and what you lead with. And so thank you so much for the time today and sharing all you have with our listeners.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me, Kim.
For our listeners, we have resources relevant to our conversation today that you can access by visiting couragetoadvancepodcast.com. And remember to like and follow our podcast on your favorite platform so more leaders can benefit from these conversations. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Courage to Advance, where transformative leadership isn't about having all the answers, it's about having the courage to find them.